Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special event. I'm not going to chair it, but I'm just going to make a few announcements. This is part of the Liverpool Literary Festival 2018, our second festival, and we are part of the 10th anniversary celebrations of Liverpool as European Capital of Culture. I'm delighted to say that the Institute of Irish Studies has sponsored this event. And we are very grateful for their support of the Literary Festival. I'd ask you all to switch off your mobile phones now, or just check that they're on silent. At the end, we'll leave some time for audience questions, but please wait for microphones so that you can be heard. And wait, please, at the end of the session, will you wait for our speakers to go downstairs to the bookstall where you can buy their books and get your books signed and you can speak to them. And that is in the cafe downstairs, and it's right at the back of the cafe, the furthest away from the entrance doors. So Blackwell's will be waiting to meet you there. I'm now very happy to hand over to tonight's chair, Frank Shovlin, who is Professor of Irish Literature at the University's Institute of Irish Studies. He's also the authorised biographer of John McGahn, whose letters he's currently editing. So, Frank Shovlin.
Thanks very much, Helen, and you're all very welcome to this evening's event, which will take the form of a conversation between Sebastian Barry and Roy Foster. When I first became aware of Sebastian Barry's work in the 1980s and early 90s, it was as a playwright of works such as The Steward of Christendom and Boss Grady's Boys. Plays with a social conscience, with a sharp awareness of outsiders in Irish history. Whether they be the dead of World War I, those on the losing side of the Anglo-Irish War, or the institutionalized, marginalized, and forgotten. Today, Sebastian is better known as a novelist, but he has transferred many of his dramatic preoccupations to his fiction. Born in Dublin and living in County Wicklow, Sebastian's novels and plays have won, among other awards, the Independent Booksellers Prize and the James Tait Black Prize. He has had two novels, A Long, Long Way, 2005, and The Secret Scripture, 2008, shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. His most recent novel, Days Without End, set around the period of the American Civil War, was named Costa Book of the Year for 2016 and won the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. In conversation with Sebastian this evening is Ireland's greatest living historian, Roy Foster. A native of County Waterford, Roy is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and was Professor of Modern British History at Birkbeck before becoming the first Carroll Professor of Irish History at the University of Oxford in 1991, a position which he held until his retirement in 2016. He is the author of books such as Modern Ireland, 1600 to 1972, a magisterial two-volume life of W.B. Yeats, recently Vivid Faces, The Revolutionary Generation in Ireland, 1890 to 1922, a book which was awarded the British Academy Medal for transforming area. Like Sebastian, Roy's work, among many other things, has tried to shine a light into previously unregarded or insufficiently nuanced aspects of the Irish story. As interested in literature and art as in historiography, I can think of no better scholar and reader to tease out with Sebastian this evening the trajectory and achievements of a life in writing. Please welcome Sebastian Barry and Roy Foster.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for the invitation to come here and to talk to Sebastian Barry, one of the most agreeable things I can imagine doing. Sebastian, you are the laureate of Irish fiction. As far as I'm concerned, you are the laureate.
You are the greatest, and the best-looking Irish historian.
Enough.
I felt that was missing from Frank's introduction.
Enough plomos. you are the laureate of Irish fiction. As far as I'm concerned, you are the laureate of Irish fiction. But you also are, for the next 3 years, the formal laureate of Irish fiction. You've recently given, I suppose, an inaugural lecture, is that what it would be called? Called The Lives of the Saints. I'd like you to tell us what the relation of Irish fiction is to Irish life at this particular moment, when it's so much at the forefront of everyone's attention, another Irish Booker winner and so forth. But I'd also like you to tell us about the lives of the saints, which not enough of us know about.
Well, what a strange country we live in, where innocent works of art, you might say, become the place where the citizens look for explication and inspiration. I'm not sure if it could be said to be the same thing here, but there is in Ireland, I have noticed, in my 63 years of Irishness, a very interesting and, for a writer, life-giving hunger for the often haphazard, sideways glancing effort of the writer to not encapsulate the moment or the present or anything like that, but somehow to offer a document that gives the sufficient form of experience solace, both to endure Ireland and also to create that final statement I think all Irish citizens do make, maybe just before they go asleep, which is, you know, thank God I'm here in this country and thank God I'm Irish. There's a strange emergency in being Irish, and the books, the novels, the plays, oftentimes serve that emergency in a very interesting way. There may be maybe other countries have the same, but
is there a particular moment now, a particular historical moment that's being served by Irish fiction in a special way?
Well, I think it's always, in essence, the same moment, mutatis mutandis. Ireland, while there's a continuous population, there's also a sense always of discarding Ireland's. And there's a necessity to dispense with 19th century Ireland, to dispense with 20th century Ireland, to build upon something, to always be looking for a new country, as if we're always having a 1916 revolution every year. But at the same time, there's a nostalgia in the proper sense of the word, nostalgos, the Greek sense of a sickness for returning home, for those discarded Irelands. And I think in a lot of the work, say in the work of Come to Being, there is a sense of serving that righteous nostalgia, but at the same moment recognizing the need to be on our pins and ready to learn the new steps of the new dance that's before us, whatever it is.
You find it in history, and you've won prizes as an author of historical novels. You've also written about a true history of lies. I know one of your wonderful characters has referred to discovering a true history of lies. How much does that apply to especially your most recent novel, which is a novel recreating history and in a way opening up a period that's often lied about in America?
Well, it seems to me, having done it for 40 years, that I mean, we are a curious creature, and some of our concerns are curious, and some of our preoccupations, as in novel writing, are very, very curious, because it seems to me the art of the novel is the art of getting everything wrong for a good purpose. In a way, I let myself off the hook of scholarship because I'm not a scholar, because I couldn't read or write really till I was 8. I was innocent of those techniques. I understood the world phonically and the conversation coming out of my people's mouths. So I don't rest my faith in scholarship, but I do like to comfort myself, to offer myself the solace of reading 100 books, for instance, about American history and about Native American history before you attempt a book like Days Without End. But finally, the thing you're dependent on is something much more mysterious, much more innate, buried much deeper possibly even than the Homo sapiens sapiens brain. It's a previous brain as well. It's the few million years of Australopithecus and the other geezers and geezeresses that we were before this. Very recent thing. And we're also writing with those imperatives of those previous brains.
You say you're not a scholar, but those 100 books are surely the evidence of scholarship and that immersion. And one of the things about Days Without End is that astonishing sense of being there. And there are moments in that book which have no need to be there, which aren't part of the narrative drive. I'm thinking of an old Indian widower in a hut by a river who makes buttons out of mussel pearls and who is there and who talks in Shawnee to Winona when they call by. And every detail of him is real. It's one of those moments that Carlyle talked about in history where the curtain, the blanket of the dark is lifted up. And you see a little brilliant moment. Those moments, I would suggest you can't come unless you're immersed in a wide, wide range of reading, out of which then comes that subconscious thing you just mentioned.
Well, you have to know that, and it's obvious in a way once you know it, that part of America was the harvesting of what it was and the turning of America into items you could sell, like the shells becoming buttons. Once you know that, that's your ticket. But it is still a ticket offered to a childish imagination. I actually remember very well writing that little piece of the book, because they're only trying to get across the river, aren't they? And the adventure of writing a book is hard to overstate in that you're being constantly overwhelmed by the fear of having nothing to say today and then finding this material is in front of you. So when you get to a certain moment like that, which is a little outside of the book, as you say, a little bit even outside, I would suggest, even of one's ability, because you've hit on something not to do with you or your writerliness, but a creatureliness, a universal creatureliness of us as a creature. And because specifically they're sitting beside a river in America with this man, and a river they don't even know the name of, which seemed to me also important. Also not to know things. Yeah. You know, it was important not to know about the river as it was to know about the buttons.
And the window in the cottage, the glass is made by a membrane from a cow's stomach.
Yes.
But of course, Thomas doesn't use the word membrane because that's not the kind of word he would use. But it's again one of those little quiddities which absolutely hold you. And I want to move on from that to the language in the book. When I opened that book, the first moment of it, about laying out a corpse in Missouri, I was held because of the voice that was not like any voice I'd heard you write in before, but which is sustained astonishingly throughout. Do you wait and wait for that voice to come, or does something like the thought of laying out a corpse in Missouri suggest it quickly, early on?
Well, you wait and wait and wait, frankly, like an Egypt. Because after all, maybe it's never going to come. Maybe this isn't the book you're supposed to be writing. And I did spend 9 impressive months writing a first chapter about Thomas McNulty during the famine here. In Ireland. And, well, here too, obviously, because we came to Liverpool. And I thought it was a pretty good chapter. It was 30 pages. I worked very hard writing it. But then I realized one morning that there was a problem, because I thought, he just is not going to talk about this. So why am I writing this? I mean, it's very fine to maybe have read all this stuff about the Irish famine, and maybe this is true in some way, but Thomas wouldn't talk about this, because like a soldier won't talk about the war, he's not going to be talking about the famine, the thing that has shaped him, but also the thing that he has escaped. So maybe the next morning, feeling equally foolish, he said, the method of laying out a corpse in Missouri sure took the proverbial cake. And actually the reason I was able to hear that sentence was I had in my research discovered that they don't say biscuit in America. If I hadn't read that, I couldn't have written that sentence, because it's the cake that makes the difference in that sentence. And then my feeling was that having made that sentence, I did get pretty excited. It's as well you don't know me always when I'm at home working, because it's not a pretty sight. And then I thought, my God, this is Thomas. And then in behind that book, as if you could have, that sentence wasn't just one sentence, it was black with sentences behind it. And what I had to do was spend a few months just tilting it so I could find it. And then I was going in every day. I was like a lunatic. I was so excited. I tried to keep calm, when you're typing, because otherwise it's difficult. But, and then of course, I'm entirely teetotal, but in the evenings, I just turned to drink because I had to live as well. I had to calm down. I had to be nice to the children and all the rest of it. So, 2 glasses of wine. I started with 1. Everyone does. 2 glasses. By Christmas, Ali said, I think you should stop, because I think you're probably heading for alcoholism, to kind of a 3-month sprint. So I did stop then.
I have to say, you write about drink drunkenness and drink dependence in an extrasensory way, which for a non-drinker is, to me, you, a non-drinker, is profoundly impressive. Our Lady of Sligo, I'm thinking The Temporary Gentleman, works which are fueled by their central character's addictions to drink, and it comes through in an extremely powerful and ominous and alarming way.
Well, the shells of drinkers don't get made into buttons. They get made into nails for punching into the grandchildren.
That's the first absolute epigram of the night.
And my grandmother's drinking, my grandmother, May Kerwin, was, I having tried to write a novel about her, initially a magnificent person, dangerous in her magnificence, in a small town in Sligo, of Sligo. And she was part of your Vivid Faces generation. She was thinking, because she was a brilliant pianist and because she was a brilliant person in every way and incredibly good looking, and went to Galway University to do a degree when that was still unusual. She was the first woman in Sligo to wear trousers, for God's sake. She thought with the new country, that she could go up to Dublin maybe and maybe work in government, or she had all these plans. And then she married my grandfather, who was a soldier, a traveler, and a drinker. And I guess she learned her drinking at the age of 30 from him. And they were out in Africa starting to drink. And I think she started to drink because the other wives in Africa used to give her the cherries from the cocktails. And she got a taste for the alcohol. And it was her ruination. But what was forensically interesting about it for me is that it didn't just ruin her and her marriage, but it ruined, in essence, my mother. Although my mother's recovery from it was in its own way magnificent. She made herself into a completely unique Irish actress in the Abbey Theatre.
Great actress.
The other sister, Mary, who's still alive, thankfully, became a famous singer, Mary O'Hara. They sang and danced and acted, and my mother was very fond of tap dancing. They tap danced their way out of their mother's drinking. They were only very young. Mary had her own BBC series when she was 17. She was the lady who played the harp. And they were sitting in Dunseverick one morning, and the mother was probably drunk in the bedroom. And she had a gap in her concert, and she said to my mother, who was 19 at the time, Mel was probably 17, I need a song. Do you know any old song I could have? And my mother said, no, but sure, I'll write one. So she, at the Formica table in the kitchen, and she did a translation of Archie Cohen. And it's The Quiet Land of Erin, which is a very famous song. Unfortunately, she never copyrighted it. And she said, oh, thanks very much, I'll sing that. And that became an immensely, but see, maybe without the drinking, there wouldn't be the Quiet Land of Erin. So.
Terrific. I'll get back to your family later.
I'm trying to look at the good side of everything.
I want to stay a little with Days Without End.
Okay.
Because it's your most recent book. It's, to me, it is a masterpiece. And I think it's a book that stays vivid in the mind of everyone who's read it. It's also a book about a strange marriage, the marriage between these two men.
It certainly is.
And most
a
beautifully
great marriage.
And subtly conveyed. And looking at your work in general, in the last few days, I've been thinking, but it's full of strange marriages. Anna and Beatrice.
Isn't the world full of strange marriages?
It is, but your work, the two nuns in Fred and Jane, one of my favourite of your short plays. Lizzie Finn's marriage is strange enough. Florence Nightingale and James Miranda Barry, in a sense, are marooned in a marriage on the edge of Hades, where we meet them in the wonderful haunted railway station in Whistling Psyche. Boss Grady's Boys, your, I think, first play?
Yeah.
The two old men are, in a sense, bonded as well.
They're in the same
marriage.
bed.
It's been a theme from the very beginning. Much attention has been paid to it in your latest novel, but would you agree that it's always been a theme there?
Well, I again, being 63, inevitably you have your doubts about the creature you are and the one and that belongs to the other creatures in the human story. And sometimes you can be bleak enough to think this radiant planet might have just been better off if those ladies in West Africa, or wherever they were, hadn't somehow made a leap and created this, all of us, all modern humans come from those women. And sometimes you have your doubts about that, but one of the things that I find inspiring, and I rest my faith in it, is the curious wrestling and wrestling that people do to find their partners. And sometimes when they're successful, these completely unlikely integers come together to make this new, this x plus y is equal to, this new z, which is a marriage. It's the only thing that's, I mean, I am irreligious, I don't believe in St. Peter's Gate, but if it happens to be so, and I get there, I know he will say, well, you have done so much odd things in your life, but that marriage with that Protestant girl of yours, that gets you in here. I just feel that's the only thing. Like, I am a Catholic, but I thought I knew, I didn't vocalize this, but maybe I think now that I married a Presbyterian, just in case, that would be important. But I set a high value of that. You'll have to ask Ali if I have been all she hoped for, but she's all I ever hoped for. And the fact that we had children from that marriage is just to me miraculous. I thought I was going to be a lonely young idiot and a lonely old idiot. I thought I was just going to write and that was going to be it, and I was going to be poor, and it's going to be very difficult and troubling, and I would be, you know, depressed or whatever. But these creatures, let's call them human beings, but, you know, Plato said there's an essence of things before you name them. And that's what I've been trying to get out in my work, is the essence of people themselves, almost before you'd write a novel about them, to keep them floating in a sort of beginning state or a half unseen state, so that I'm not writing about Thomas and handsome John Cole, his beloved, and Winona, their daughter. Not sort of writing about, but they're telling me about themselves or showing me themselves just the moment before they actually say something about it. You know, to capture them. Like the watercolorist goes out at 6 a.m. in the morning, like my grandfather, and becomes devoured by midges, but it doesn't matter because he's capturing something that he can only get in the light of 6 a.m. And that's why it's mysterious. It's not exactly twilight, but it is the light of dawn, this whole thing happens in.
One more point about Days Without End. It describes a genocidal history. I know your work very well, and the violence in it absolutely caught me by surprise. I remember I was in fact in America with you when you were talking about it before it was published. We were in Texas, if you remember. And the way you talked about the history of Native Americans in Texas did not go down well in Baylor University in Waco. How did the book go down in America when it eventually came out and gave this uncompromising history of bloodletting?
Well, it's hard to know because there's that first phalanx of critics who are going to be very open-minded and very liberal and very all-encompassing, and will try and see what something is rather than what they wished it was, a good critic. So at that level, it's welcomed. But it is a criticism. It's not so much a criticism as a wish in it that if America wants to talk about greatness and being great again, or whatever dreams obviously millions of people have, we have to accept that, you could predicate it. Before you say that, you have to acknowledge, I think, what Native Americans now will say, that America is a stolen country. America in recent history, and that's the thrill of it for a novelist or an historian, it's very recent. You can see there are photographs. Countless photographs for the Civil War, the Indian Wars. So, and this was part of my promise a private promise I made in respect of a man called Peter Matheson, very great American writer who died in his 90s recently. And he busied himself with thinking about Native America now. And he got himself into immense trouble in the 70s in the standoff between the FBI and the CIA and the Native American, the Sioux Indians in South Dakota, and wrote a big book about it and was sued for $23 million by the FBI or whatever it was. And for 20 years was pursued in this way. But he was an astounding person, this Peter Matheson. He sent me that enormous book after I'd met him in America, and he said, and I was going to go back and talk to him because I was going to do this, and he said, let's meet again before the smoke clears. That's what he wrote in the book. And I was intent on doing that, and then he died. But included in this sense of sudden exit was, I said something to myself. I didn't say it to him, but I made a kind of pact with myself to try and make that clear. And I was trying to make it clear also because as an Irish person, myself, yourself, many here, that Thomas, for better or for worse, understood in some ways, even along lines in himself he wasn't familiar with, what colonialism was. That for better or for worse, the person he was partly the result of 700 years of being colonized. And it's well said that the colonizers in Ireland learned how to deal with native peoples in Ireland and then went on to America to act out these pieces of knowledge. And that's also the reason, because my ancient concern with this great uncle of mine who was at the Indian Wars was, what was it for a man like him to go to America and in essence, and for reasons of hunger, and if he hadn't done it he'd have died, engage in this process of annihilation that in a way should have been the very last reason he would find for perpetuating his own life.
Before we reluctantly leave Days Without End, will you read us something?
I will. I'll stand up.
About violence.
It's all going to get much, much more awful for you now because I'm going to sing for a second. But it's all right. It won't last long. This is a little bit of the book where he's just telling us, because again, once you're west of the Missouri in the 1850s, 60s, there's no Lidl's, there's no Tesco. If you're provisioning your platoons or you're in the army, you're going to have to go and get the meat. So it's a sort of violence that seems to us incomparable sort of violence, but unnecessary violence to take down this creature, which they're going to do in this little passage. So I'll just very briefly sing, and maybe we'll sing badly in honor of Peter up there somewhere. Oh, what is this taking hold of me, blind in my eye, so I can't see, a hobbling my tongue, so I can't walk, spancing my leg, so I can't walk. Whoa, dare Oh, Dad, won't you spare me over for another year? So what happens next day was me and John Cole and Watchorn himself and also a nice son of a bitch called Pearl. We went up with the scouts to find that herd. We came into marshy ground first, but the Shawnee boys knew the path through and we weaved along it content enough. Cook had put some of his cooked sparrows in our stomachs. We were after something bigger. Shawnee, you seem to remember one of them was called Bird Songs, it happens. Cool-minded, timber-skinned boys they were, giving themselves the old information in their own lingo, had done up their prayer bags the night before. Kind of lucky charms they liked to put together in an old bag made from the scrotum of a buffalo. They were lashed to their ponies' necks. Now, they rode without saddles. Long before we had news of it, they were going slower. They knew something was close. They brought us about a mile sideways so we could start to work in up the wind. There was a big, low, sickle-shaped hill before us, covered in a dark grass, and the country there was quiet and almost windless, except for a sound you were guessing might be the sound of the sea. There was no sea thereabouts, we knew. Then we breasted the hill. It was giving a horizon of maybe 4 miles, and I drew in my breath amazed, because right down below us was a herd of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 buffalo. They must have taken a vow of silence that morning. Shawnees now were putting their ponies into polite trotting, and ourselves likewise. We were to go down as close to the buffalo as we could without stirring them. Maybe buffalo isn't the smartest chicken in the coop. We had the wind in our faces, such as it was. We knew as soon as they felt us there was going to be fireworks. Sure enough, the nearest dozen must have felt us. They started to stumble forward all of a sudden, nearly falling down. We must have smelled like death to them. We hoped we did. Birdsong kicked forward and we kicked forward. John Cole was a beautiful rider. He streaked through the Indians and fled after the biggest cow he could spot. I had a line on a big cow too, must have been that we preferred the cow meat. Then the land dipped again. The near buffalo had set everything moving. It was 10,000 hooves then drumming the hard earth, and the whole cavalcade pouring down into the declivity. Seemed to swallow them, every last one. Then the ground rose in front of us, and there they were again, the flood of buffalo, like a big boil of black molasses in a skillet, surging up. Goddamn blackberries, they were as black as. My cow had taken a wild run to the right. She was gearing herself to go through her comrades. I don't know if an angel hadn't given her a message I was on her tail. You got to treat a buffalo like a killer, like a rattlesnake on legs. She wants to kill you before you kill her. She wants to lure you onto, and then she wants to suddenly run sideways at you, knock down your horse in full flight, and then come back before Saturday and stamp you to death. You never want to fall to the ground on a buffalo hunt, if I can just instruct you in that. My cow won't act out of character, but I got to get myself in close, get a shot into her head as best I can. It's no easy task to keep your rifle raised and ready when your horse was seeming to be an aficionado of every goddamn rabbit hole out there. He better keep his footing. Maybe we are moving at 30, 40 miles an hour now. Maybe we are sheeting along like the wind. Maybe the herd is making a noise like a great storm coming down from the mountains. But my heart was up. Then I couldn't care what happened unless I could get my bullet into her. Blooms in my head the picture of the troopers roasting her and cutting great steaks out of her, the blood running down the meat. Well, I am caterwauling now, and I see the other Shawnee, now nameless in my memory. He's riding down a most splendid bull. He is sitting back on his pony Indian style, and he is shooting arrows into the bull, who is only a raging, roaring mass of meat and hair. That sight vanishes in a vanishing second. My own task is at hand. Sure enough, she makes a brilliant-minded lunge sideways at me, just as I think I'm steady to strike. But my horse isn't the first time out against buffalo, and he skips to the right like a good dancer. And now we have drawn a bead on that cow, and I fire, and the lovely orange flame shoots the bullet forth, and the burning black steel is absorbed into her shoulder. That girl is all shoulder. We burn along the grasses together. The herd seems to take a violent turn left, as if to escape her approaching fate. I fire again, then I see her right horn sort of dip down, just a half a foot. Well, glory be to God, that's the good sign. My heart swells, my pride explodes in my breast. Down, down she goes, a blaze of dust and power, and she takes 15 feet to reach a stop. Must have pierced her heart. That's a dead buffalo.
it will come as no surprise to you that I now want to talk about drama. Sebastian, you're unusual in your...
Odd even.
In every way, but you're a poet, and I think a fine poet. You're a great novelist, but it's your plays that are what some of us learned about you first. And you've said from time to time you're not going to write another play, and thank God you always do. Most recently, and not many of you will have had the chance to see this, but I hope you will, a beautiful little play called On Blueberry Hill, which was it in the Dublin Theatre Festival?
Last year, yeah.
Last year, and is it to have an outing in this island?
It's going to New York and it's going to tour Ireland, but I'm not sure what happens.
It must
there.
come here. Again, a play about a strange marriage between two men in a prison cell who are linked by horrific murders. It's a wonderful play, and I am commended to you. But you're a man of the theatre as well as being a playwright, and the two aren't always exactly the same thing. Unlike, say, Brian Friel, who had to apprentice himself very carefully to what it was like to be in a theatre and did intensely, you were brought up in a trunk, effectively, like Judy Garland. Will you tell us something about the theatrical vein in your family, notably your very distinguished mother, but there are other elements too, I think.
Well, we had a very important, untraceable, magical person that my mother valued highly. And it doesn't matter in a way whether she existed or not, but this is a woman called Lizzie Finn. And in my mother's knowledge of her, it was her grandmother. And she was a woman who, well, I'll tell you my fictional take on her fictional take, but she was a music hall dancer of some stripe and ended up marrying some sort of well-to-do person in the west of Ireland. See, I'm being very hesitant because none of it is true, but never mind. We'll ignore all that.
True history of life.
And when she died in childbirth, and possibly her husband also, because he was in the army, he may have died too. The family, let's put it this way, this well-to-do family got cold feet about having this offspring and gave her away, this child, to supposedly the Batman of this man, this army man. And this person then mysteriously metamorphosed into my great-grandmother, Mary Donnellan in Sligo, who was tormented all her life by the possibility not that her mother had been a music hall dancer, but that she didn't know anything about her mother and that she was illegitimate. And to be illegitimate in Sligo in the 20s and 10s was a catastrophe beyond speaking of. My grandfather told me, her son, my grandfather, told me that towards the end of her life, she lived into her 90s, he made it his business to find out who her parents really were. And he said in Christchurch Cathedral, he found the marriage license for Lizzie and this man called Robert Gibson. And I have tried to write a play about that. And he brought this news to his mother. He said, the good news is you're not illegitimate. The bad news is you're a Protestant. Because my great-grandmother was so religious that, I think she promised one of her own children to the nuns when she was 3. I mean, Ireland, I tell you, has changed, thankfully, but what a strange place we all come from. Anyway, this idea of this hoofer, hoofing their way through the 1870s or 80s, was so important to my mother. And it does explain her own, I mean, she was truly, this Joan Hart, her name was, she died 10 years ago, but she was truly an astonishingly gifted actress. I love when, for instance, our mutual friend, Colm Tabine talks about her. There's something about There's a special joy to be felt when Colm Tóibín talks highly of your mother. I tell you, I can't explain that, but I'm just throwing it out there. And seeing her in various performances. So, but when I was a little boy, I was quite a dreamy child, and as I say, I couldn't read or write, so I was listening, but I was also dreaming, daydreaming a lot. And I made many errors as a child, which turned out to be quite good errors to make if you want to survive a childhood like mine. And one of the more beneficent errors was that everybody's mother went off in the morning to rehearse all day and didn't come back till midnight after doing the evening show. I think I must have thought that was what mothers did. So when I went to see, when she brought me to the theatre where this happened, where all this took place, the Abbey as it is, and she set me down in the auditorium and left me with Lily Shanley, the front of house woman. Maybe I was 8, and the lights went down, which was curious enough for a child, because usually you go into a room, don't you turn the lights on? Here was a room you go into, turn the lights on. How strange. And then lights did come on, but not in our room, this other room. And in comes this old lady, I think it was the Countess Kathleen, one of these plays. This old, decrepit lady, no doubt younger than me now, but you know, to my young eyes. And it was my mother. I could see it was my mother. And I was thinking, well, how are we going to get home now? Is it just, what's the next thing? Funerals and... I thought it was all real, and actually my best experiences in the theatre, for instance with Donal and the Stewart of Christendom, was, even as a man of 40 as I was, feeling in the theatre that in fact it was real. That the transformation of Donal into Thomas in the play was real. And Donal believed that as well. When you have Tuppenny Halfpenny magic like that, you know, you can't say it in public, so I obviously didn't say it to you. But it is what makes you go on with the thing.
It's 20-carat magic, that.
It's shamanic.
You recreated your family, past and almost present, in a series of plays. The Only True History of Lizzie Finn, a particular favourite of mine, which was recently revived by the great Blanche McIntyre, done wonderfully, I thought, in London. The Stewart of Christendom, which you've mentioned. And then the family spreads into the novels, into Annie Dunn, into A Long, Long Way. It's a tapestry out of which you pick certain bits. And I'd like you to say, before we hear a little perhaps from one of the novels that has a family theme in it, I'd like you to say how the interaction between putting something on the stage and putting it into a novel happens. Are there bits of your massive, tangled, half-imagined, wholly magical family history that lend themselves to drama and bits that lend themselves to novels? Or are the genres interpenetrable, interchangeable?
For me, there are no genres. There's only the same darkness and the same searching around. You know that awful moment when the electricity supply company has forgotten to tell you there's a power cut, and you're in your own house, and you don't know where anything is, pitch black, and you're feeling your way, and you realize you actually don't know where you live, not by touch. And that's very much trying to find a novel where everything is pitch black, all your other senses have been deprived, are taken away from you, and you've been deprived of them, and what can you sense now? And as you know, the old Irish poets used to go away, was it for 14 years, apprenticeship, in a room, in houses without windows. So there is something in that in order to learn their metrics in the dark. Yeah. And we're always learning our metrics in the dark. We're always pacing without moving in the dark, because we don't quite know where we are, but we know that it's important also to get out of that room. Sometimes when the lights are turned on, it's a play, and sometimes the lights turned on, it's a book. Sometimes I've looked for somebody in the dark of a novel, or in the dark of a play, for instance, another book called The Whereabouts of Ennis McNulty, and I looked for Ennis McNulty in a play for quite a long time, and I couldn't find him in the play because he was the sort of character who doesn't say anything, not very helpful in a play. So I looked for him in the book, and that was better because I could do it in the third person. It's more the way you're going to finally arrive in the amity and extraordinary friendship between you and your characters, arrive at a proper representation of them that is both wildly honest and also in a curious way respectful. It's the place where respect becomes a good instinct in human affairs rather than false respect.
I want to stop you there and ask you to read a piece that I think illustrates that very beautifully from A Long, Long Way.
Well, this is just a little tiny bit about. This is Willie Dunn is the boy in this book, and like 200,000 other Irishmen, they all volunteered for the First World War. They all volunteered. There was no conscription in Ireland, and 50,000 men were lost in the war. 1916 intervened halfway through the war. So by the end of the war, speaking crudely, their impulse to go was both socially doubtful and also almost redundant. Willie Dunn in the book is the son of one of the last chief superintendents of the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and that's my great-grandfather. So this is the imagined son. And he turned up in the Steward of Christendom, which if we have time, I'll just read from the end of it, as this boy of light. Initially, that's all he was. He was this boy of light on the manuscript. If you go to Texas, where all my old rubbish is, you'll see it there. And then he started to sing the Ave Maria, which I did myself as a child, to his father in this play. His father's in an old person's home or a county hospital. He's in ruins. He's not well. He's only got long johns on. He's not washed. And this boy, and eventually the boy, I saw him with the army uniform. He's still only, his voice hasn't broken. He's a child in an army uniform, and instead of blood on the uniform, he has gold. And that's who he became in the drafting of the play. And then after the play, I thought, well, could I write a book for Willie, for that boy that just turned up as the boy of light? And I thought, no, I couldn't possibly do that, because I don't want to go to the First World War. It's much too terrifying. But I did, for some reason. And this is a little moment where Willie's back from the trenches, and he's come up into Dublin Castle, where his family actually live, which is the centre of British powers was. They have their quarters there. And he's come in past the sentry. The sentry is a Tommy too, of course, but he's nice and clean. But Willie hasn't had a chance to clean himself, so he's covered in lice and all the rest of it. His little sister Dolly's here, he's only a child, and his other sisters, Maud and Annie. I wrote another novel called Annie Dunn for Annie when she was for her whole life. Anyway, so this is in the third person, but it's all really in Willie's way of understanding the world. And he's just come back, and he's just come in, and he says, or I say for him, now his father came up from the yards with little Dolly led by the hand. And Dolly broke from her father's grip and came running without a word to Willie and hugged his dirty legs. Willie stroked her head gingerly, adoringly. She was adding her happy tears to the soiled uniform. There you are, Dolly, said Willie. There you are at last. Ah, Willie, Willie, said his father, all the great height of him and the wide waistband straining as ever. The veritable hero returns. How are you, Papa? And I've missed you. I hope you got all my letters. And I hope you got all mine. I got many, and I suppose it was all of them, and you were very kind to think of writing to me. My God, Willie, he said. 'Twas my honour to write to you. Willie, Willie, said Dolly, what are you after bringing me? He hasn't had a chance to do anything, I'm sure, said his father. Leave the lad be. We'll go down to Duffy's after, Dolly, and see what big gobstopper she has for us, said Willie, a little abashed. You will, of course, said his father.
Then he cleared out the bigger girls, and Willie stripped out of his uniform and his long johns, and his father bagged them up and opened the rear door and flung them out to Maud and Annie for ginger boiling. Dolly sat on an old chair. It was a finely carved one, but very spindly, that had been their mother's special chair in the bedroom of old, a dressed chair. Dolly watched the show gleefully, swinging her legs like a clock gone mad. "Can we not come in?" Annie teased, and her father roared back at her like she was a rascally hen advancing into the house against the wishes of the yard woman. So James Patrick, a man of 6'6", stood his son William, a man of 5'6", into the steaming zinc bath, as indeed Willie's mother had done 1,000 times while Willie was a boy. And it was a strange enough thing to see the policeman throwing on the accustomed moleskin apron, kept for the purpose, no doubt, of washing Dolly still, and fetching in close the basin with the big sponge and the carbolic soap. And he lathered the sponge up mightily, and he started to lave his son from head to foot, cascading the water neatly over everything. And the lice must have been flying from Willie Dunn, just like those poor men in Sackville Street from the Battens, and soon the water was speckled with them, little writhing white creatures. He saw under the suds or through them that his skin was all blotched with red circles, so he supposed he had the ringworm into the bargain. Certainly the nits must be in his head, because it was terrible itchy now in the steaming heat. But his hair was only recently cut as short as the Viceroy's lawn, so the nits had not much chance against his father's knit comb, which he wielded now like a delicate surgeon, combing out the ends. Then he asked his son politely to step out, and he fetched the big sheet from the range in the scullery and came back in and wound it round and round his son till he sucked the wetness off him. Then a pair of clean long johns of his father's was fetched. The legs had to be rolled up on the arms, and then Willie put on his old working suit from when he used to go out building. His uniform would be a while drying, what with the heavyish material in it. Then when he was all ship-shape, his father put his arms around him and held him close to him for a few moments, like an actor on the stage. It's not a thing you would see in real life anyway. There was a faraway look on his father's face, like it was all years ago and otherwise, and maybe they were still in Dalkey and he was a little lad. But he was a soldier now of some 19 years, and for all that he was glad of his father's arms around him, strange as it was, strange and comforting as it was. "Come on and get a hat on, Willie, and we'll go," shouted Dolly Dunn.
I'm conscious of the time and that we want 10 minutes for questions at the end, but I also want another reading which, because of its echoes with that, the end of the Stewart of Christendom, where the ghost of Willie appears to his father in the county home. And again, it's a kind of beautiful reversal in a different work, an earlier work, but it's the way that you weave together these stories and repeat them and pick them up, and I'd like to end with that. But before then, the themes that your plays especially circle around and come back to are contrition and redemption. And you're not a religious man, as you said. And also, I think, and we'll hear this in the Stewart of Christendom, forgiveness. In terms of what you write about, you once said quite recently that the one time you really recognized something of yourself in someone else was the Asperger's detective in The Bridge, which I was very struck by. And I sometimes think you write as if there's a skin missing. You're extrasensorily exposed. Is there anything that you won't write about, especially in family terms?
Well, skin missing is very good. I think caution missing. There's an important thing missing, and that is the thing most people learn is not to be past remarkable. If there's somebody unusual, the little boy I was would say, "Oh, and everyone would be, ah!" But in a way, a lot of what I do is passing remarks upon the bare fact of things passing by. because the facts themselves are rattling with poetry. That's the strange thing about facts. That's why you, for me, are one of the finest prose stylists of your generation, because you write history, but you do it with your own Ciceronian madness in a way. And you also you give that essential thing to your history on all your writing. You're reading Roy, and every page or two you find yourself with that special reader's laughter of chuckling and just being delighted. It's utterly unnecessary sometimes to the thing he's talking about, but it allows you to make that journey. And that's another thing about those things passing by and those awful moments in childhood when you've said the dreadful thing. Those things are repeated, and then they become funny. I mean, I must be the least funny person on earth, but I value this redemptive. I mean, if I believe in anything, if I choose anything, religio, I choose humor. I don't mean necessarily stand-up humor, but I choose the delight. I know the moments my children are most delighted with me, which may be few and far between, is when I laugh at what they're saying. But I laugh at what they're saying because it's so Fosterian. It's so delightful. So I think that is not a very good answer to your splendid question, but none of my answers have been up to your questions, but never mind.
Let's spare my blushes and let's hear one final reading from Sebastian from the end of The Steward of Christendom.
Well, I'm sort of honored to read this because next year, as laureate in the strange tasks of laureate, you have to write a lecture every year, and I want to try and write about Donald McCann, because next year, unbelievably, he's 20 years dead. How does that happen? Anyway, he was only 56 when he died. I was possibly 43, so I thought he was fairly elderly. That was a good life, 56. Now I realize, of course, that he's plucked away, and I didn't think that at the time. But Donald disappeared at 56. Donald, quite rightly, said by Newsweek when we toured The Steward of Christendom to America to be the greatest actor in the world. I mean, if you're feeling unrecompensed as a human being, if somebody says something like that about you, just for a moment you think, well, it was worth coming after all, despite all the mess. He was a most extraordinary person, possibly not absolutely human in the way of really great actors, some further dangerous angelic dimension, but very much in a Rilkean sense, a dangerous angel. Anyway, he did this play and changed our lives by coming in. I mean, Max Stafford Clark directed it, and Donald came to do it. And we were quite impoverished at the time, me and Ali, and we had the twins. We were heating the house with Alison's grandmother's fuel vouchers. And the grandmother had been dead for 2 years. So as you can see, it was all a bit touch and go. How do writers survive their poverty? Mysteriously is the answer. But anyway, Donald did something, and then the play because of him, was so successful that, we bought a house. And I mean, bought a house at the age of 43, whatever it was. And I remember Donald coming to the house. We asked him what he'd like for tea. He said, mackerel. I mean, whoever says, come to dinner, what would you like? Mackerel. Nobody except Donald. He specialized in lamb stews himself. And of course, strangely enough, the character in this play is given stew by the attendant, Smith. And it was played by Kieran Ahern, a wonderful actor. And Donald said Kieran Ahern was the man who put the stew into the Steward of Christendom. I mean, that's just incomparable wit, which I was referring to earlier. Anyway, this is the last little story. This is the last thing he says, and his son, he has been able, for the first time, this little boy who comes to him in the room, to actually physically touch him. So we may conclude whatever we like from that, the fact that they're now at least in the same plane. And his celebration of this fact is not some great speech or anything. It's just he beckons Willie, his son, up onto the dirty old bed beside him, and he tells him this story from his own childhood. And that's all it is. And then at the end, the play is over. Okay. There was an old woman that lived in the woods. Oh, willa, willa, willa. There was an old woman that lived in the woods down by the river Sawyer. One time, Willie, and it was Christmas time too, and I was a young fella in Kiltegan, our dog Shep went missing for some days, as dogs in winter will. I was maybe 10 or 11, and I loved that Shep and feared he was gone forever. We had got him as a young dog that had been beaten somewhere and broken till he reached our haven and uncoiled and learned to bark like a baby learns to laugh, and he shone at his work. One morning early after a fall of snow, I went out to break the ice on the rain barrel to plash my face, and I saw his tracks in the snow going up the sloping field high to the fringes of the wood, and I was greatly afeared because there were drops of blood now and then as he went, little smears of it on the cleanly snow. So I followed him up, sinking here and there in the drifts, well used to it, and on to a piece of field we called the upper garden, because it was flat there and you could see across to Baldinclass, and some said even Shillelagh in the dark woods of Cullatton. I found our dog there with the carcass of a ewe well eaten, only the hindquarters remaining. I saw my father's blue sign on the wool and knew the worst, for a dog that would kill a sheep would die himself. So in my innocence I went down to my father and told him, and he instructed me, as I was right and proper, to go back up with the rope and lead Shep down so the killing could take place. The loss of a ewe was a disaster. There'd be pounds of money gone into her. But I loved the dog so sorely I hesitated when I had the rope tied about him, and at length led him off further up the hill, across the little stand of scrubby pines, and on into the low woods, dark with snow and moss. And we went through by a snaking path, I knew, till we got to the other side, where there was a simple man living that made his living from the rabbits and maybe had need of a watchful dog. But he wouldn't take a dog that had killed, though he was a tender man enough. And it behoved me to retrace my steps back into the woods, now moving along but slowly, and the dog sort of dragging behind, as if he knew well his misdeed and his fate. And I stopped in the center of the trees, and do you know, my young legs would not go forward, they would not proceed, try as I might, and there I was all that afternoon and night with the dogs and the hazels. How is it that the drear of winter didn't eat my bones and murder me for my foolishness? Love of the dog kept me standing there as only a child can stand, without moving, thinking, the poor dog whimpering with the cold. About 5 o'clock I went on, because I heard calling over the hill here and there, and I could see black figures with lights moving and calling out to me and the dog to come home. We came down the sloping field with the neighbors about us, them not saying a word, maybe marveling at me, thinking I had been dead, and the torches and lamps making everything crazy with light, the old crabapple enlarging to the size of the field, its branches wild like arms. Down at last into the yard we came, the dog skulking on the rope just the same as the day he had arrived to us, and my father came out from the house in his big clothes, all brown with clothes and hair. 'Twas as if I had never seen him before, never looked at him in his entirety, from head to toe. And I knew then that the dog and me were for slaughter. My feet carried me on to where he stood, immortal, you would say, in the door. And he put his right hand on the back of my head and pulled me to him so that my cheek rested against the buckle of his belt. And he raised his own voice, his own face to the brightening sky and praised someone in a crushed voice, God maybe, for my safety, and stroked my hair. The dog's crime was never spoken of, but that he lived till he died. And I would call that the mercy of fathers, when the love that lies in them deeply, like the glittering face of a well, is betrayed by an emergency. And the child sees at last that he is loved and needed, and not to be lived without, and greatly.
Frank, do we have time for maybe 3 questions? We'll take 3. If any of you are okay. Mary.
Thank you.
While you were reading from Days Without End, I remember that passage very vividly, and even as a non-meat eater, it wasn't off-putting, it's riveting. And I wondered, do you read to yourself what you've written while you are writing?
Can you imagine the chaos in the house if I did that?
I could really.
They'd lock me up. No, I don't actually. But it's a lovely question because I often wonder why I don't. But it's in total silence, and I don't even like music. I don't like any noise. I used to smoke Sweet Afton, without inhaling, as Bill Clinton said, so I could get a nice fog going in the room. But then, of course, after 30, you can't do that anymore. And it's just, again, maybe looking for that enclosed thing. But when I was a little boy, I understood language, I think, as almost a ticker tape, physical element coming out of the mouths of my great aunt or whoever was speaking. And so I can't say I don't hear it. See, somebody else is making the noise. So I see it and I hear it. And if I'm not seeing it and if I'm not hearing it, then I'm not working. And for that reason, it's true that a writer is not the person who actually knows the technique of writing down, although obviously you need that. But the writer, oddly enough, is really a seer and a hearer of things. I don't mean a seer as in a mystical sense. But that's the most important quality. And if you consider Homer or these other people, then obviously those works existed purely in the mouth for so long. And that's the way I understand it. The writing it down is a sort of inconvenience because it's still, for me, a sort of an immense task in a sense. The idea of it is still daunting because you never lose that panic you had as a child when you were 8 and your sister could read at the age of 3. So you did feel there's something amiss. And I still feel that in a way. But no, I don't. I don't.
Second question. Anyone? Yes, over here.
Nor do I want to hear a play until the first day of rehearsal. I have no disrespect for dramaturgs, but I don't want to be talking about it until the actors say it the first day. That's the first time I hear a play.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Very short question. What have we got to look forward to? What's next?
What's next?
Panic. I don't know. What is next? Well, actually, I regard writing as only an adjunct to gardening. We have an acre of garden. This recent revelation that glyphosate is a terrible poison for everybody. Now everyone is afraid to spray. And my answer to this is a sort of literary answer. I've bought a flamethrower, which I'm now burning the weeds. So that's what's next, really.
I think that's all we're going to get out of it. Have we got a final question? Yes, in the front over here.
Oh, hi, thanks. I was just wondering what your views are on the film version of The Secret Scripture. As a playwright, you'd be expecting others to take your work and do something with it. Did you expect that when you were writing that novel? And how do you feel about the film version?
No, I mean, making films from novels is, in essence, a sort of huge, unlikely, just a great piece of luck, really. Because, they're going to give you money for that. And you're not necessarily even going to write the screenplay. So that is a great day. Somebody at the moment, let me answer it this way. Somebody at the moment is working on a film of Days Without End. This is a rather magical person called Tessa Ross in London, and she's found an amazing director and screenwriter. They're probably this weekend meeting for the first time to talk properly about the book. This feels to me like a process that I am not engaged in, but somehow seems proper to me, appropriate, as the Latins say, and proper to the book. It was different with The Secret Scripture. I mean, in a way, for me, the difficulty with The Secret Scripture as a film, for me, was the fact that the man doing it is one of those rare people who is also an auteur. He's an author. There's a very great director called Jim Sheridan who wrote his own screenplay for My Left Foot, for The Field, for, you know, and he needs to do that. And for me, I was like I was like that bitter owl fella that no one wants to be, that we all become occasionally watching it. Because I thought, well, where's my dialogue? I mean, there wasn't one bit of it. Where are the scenes that, you know, whether they're worth anything, ultimately were worth something to people because they invested in them. And he did his own thing, and he made it into a new thing, and it was more a palimpsest than the actual screenplay of the book. I believe, as far as I know, if I interpret him correctly, he never read the book. He wrote the screenplay from another person's screenplay who sadly died. So you can see there was a strange process going on there. And something happened that maybe in filmic terms is wonderful and part of Jim's oeuvre, but I couldn't connect to it because I didn't recognize it. Because the biggest word for me is familiar. You know, it comes from the word family. And that's what I live for, to try and find benign, familiar traces. So they become important. These made-up things become important in their sort of scriptural, for me, just. So I feel traduced. It's like, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't even have names. They gave them names hundreds of years later. But I mean, they wrote the bloody thing down, didn't they? They went to that trouble. But I mean, I'm not going to come back and rewrite, well, Colin Tavine did, but never mind. I'll leave it at that.
With that insight, I think, Robert. Frank.
I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thought it was an absolutely marvelous conversation, and I knew it would be. I've known Roy for years, but I only met Sebastian for the first time a couple of hours ago. But when I saw in the green room that they were really friends, so much so that they could insult each other, I knew that it would be a terrific event. And I'd like to really thank them for their honesty and candor. I think that we saw two humans talking to each other, not just a great historian speaking to a great author. So Sebastian will sign books downstairs, but before he does so, please show your appreciation for a wonderful event.